So, failing memory. This is Ian Stevenson. We've met him before. He's a researcher in reincarnation. And he's no longer living. He died about 6 or 7 years ago. And he was at the University of Virginia. He was a psychologist. And he started out listening to accounts of small children who remembered past lives just spontaneously. And he documented what the children said. And then he went to public records to see if the things that the children were saying could be corroborated in actual investigative terms, whether they could find some record of the person the child claims to have been. They could find the family and find out what the characteristics and circumstances were of the family. And so he did that. But he also, which I didn't know actually, was into studying paranormal phenomenon beyond just reincarnation. So he was also studying people who had ESP experiences, people who, he didn't study UFOs, but he studied people with other kinds of paranormal experiences. And he came up with a category, with two categories, which he called authentic and evidential, which is very similar to what J. Allen Hynek in the UFO investigation came up with, credibility and strangeness. So with Stevenson, he said that a report was authentic if the reporting person, the subject who was giving the account, was credible. And what they said seemed to be reasonable, that what he could tell about their history, there was no mental issues there. They weren't criminal. They weren't, a lot of other things. They had a very reputable occupation. So he called that the authenticity scale. And the evidential part of it was whether the report that the person was giving was out of the normal. There was something that it said that made a person realize, well, if person is saying this and this is true, this is certainly not what we would expect according to our normal way of looking at the world. So he talked about these two things, authentic and evidential, which is very similar to J. Allen Hynek's two qualifications for the UFO phenomenon and his investigation of various witnesses who saw them. So the first one, of course, was credibility, which is the same thing as authenticity for Stevenson. And then there was the strangeness factor. How far out of normal physics was this explanation? Was it way, way out, or was it just a little bit out? And what were the most striking anomalies that were a part of the tale or the account of this kind of occurrence? So often we discover that between the time a person has a UFO experience, the time they tell someone about it, oftentimes there's a big time lapse. So we get into the idea of, well, how good is memory? Can we trust memory? And the answer is yes and no. That, of course, people forget. But what Ian Stevenson noticed in his research, that generally the stronger the effect is of a particular interaction a person has, the more likely they're going to remember it. So if we have something that doesn't particularly strike us as very important, we're really likely to forget it. But if we have something that's very emotionally either traumatic or amazing, or it affects us in a very powerful way, then it's very unlikely that we're going to forget it. It's going to stick with us. Of course, people can ask the question, rightly so, will there be embellishment? Do we remember details wrongly? Do we add things to it as the time goes by? And of course, Ian Stevens says, yes, this does happen, but it doesn't happen quite as much as you would think. And oftentimes, he did interviews with people a year or two later to see if they would say the same story. And he kept a record of what they said the first time, and then he would keep a record of what they said the second time. And he would find there were very, very few additions, that the people more or less told the same story the same way. Often what's also very amazing in these stories is the idea that you have like a husband and wife team, and they both tell essentially the same story. So two people who are not the same person telling identically the same story. It's even, husband and wife, it's not so likely. But in some cases, you have groups of people who experience some UFO phenomenon. And when you have groups of people all saying the same thing, then, that's pretty strong evidence in general. But at any rate, as far as we're seeing here, Stevenson claims that embellishments don't really happen so much. And what he does talk about is we have first-hand accounts and second-hand accounts. There's the people who actually experience the UFOs, and then there are people who research it and talk about the people who experience the UFOs, like I'm doing now. And so there's always a chance that the person who's the second-hand explanation has their own preconceptions that they're, putting over it. And, there's nothing can be done about that because that's the way humans work, So, yes, that is possible, that the various researchers can put their own spin on something. And occasionally that happens. And we have to just get a sense of what the researcher is, whether he's trustable or she's trustable. And in this way, we have to look at it from that angle of vision. Of course, many times some of these very pronounced and very widely publicized UFOs accounts have been described by more than one researcher. So we have more than one person to go to for it. So we can judge how different researchers put forward the same case. All right, so can a person have an entirely fictitious memory? Is it possible? And the answer is, well, yes. It can happen. That this is called FMS, false memory syndrome. That especially in the beginning of psychological techniques for helping people with various problems, some researchers would try to get people to surface their traumas or issues that they had when they were very young. And sometimes the psychologist would almost expect this to happen from an individual, and so the individual would almost just come up with this, just satisfy the researcher. Or at least there would be enough of an authoritative figure in the researcher that it would distort the nature of the individual, so that they would, under social pressure, take a vague memory and reconfigure that memory to be more along the lines of what the authority figure, the psychologist or the researcher, had in mind. So this can happen. And particularly this got into a lot of hot territory, because often this was with cases of child sexual abuse, whether the child was really remembering something or whether the researcher just kind of cued the child into remembering something or rethinking through something in a different way, in a way that maybe didn't really happen, So that's possible. So the idea in psychology was for a long time that we have these repressed memories that we have, but they're repressed. But this was a part of Freud's analysis of things, and by no means do all psychologists ascribe to this concept. So this is what Richard Offshee has said, that repression is not something that every psychologist bows down and worships. It may or may not have an important role to play. And the opposite way to go is if we realize it is possible to make up memories or to re-evaluate something in a completely different light. If we go the other way, where we throw everything out, that's also going too far. That we see that in general, human memory does work. And, there are cases where it fails or details get misunderstood or mislaid. But in general, we see that memory actually does work. And this brings us to the work of Nicholas Spanos, which I'll end with here on this section today, that he wrote a book some time ago called Multiple Identities and False Memories, where this is interesting because the way that this is described gives you an understanding of how certain people think. This book said that there were several types of false memories. And the first type was hypnotically induced memories of past lives. Another category of false memories was memories of UFO encounters. And the third category of false memories was memories of ritual abuse carried out by members of satanic cults. And in the book, it basically describes the fact that the first two are patently false. Why? Because there are no UFOs, because there are no past lives. So this is the way that some researchers think. They just assume that this couldn't be true, so therefore these have to be bogus memories. And what's the proof? Well, they couldn't have happened, therefore they must be bogus. So this is kind of putting the cart before the horse, or using a circular proof system where what's false is the false memories. Why are they false? Because they're describing something that couldn't be true. Why couldn't it be true? Because we believe it couldn't be true. And so this is the kind of thing that can happen. And so we have these various close encounters. We've been talking about them now. We've seen that the UFO phenomenon is very kind of hard to get a handle on, and that there are elements of it that don't make sense from our modern scientific perspective. But who knows what our scientific perspective will be in a few years. It certainly is going to increase. And in this way, we can see that this is why it's a hard subject to study. But as we see now, more and more things are coming to the foreground, and people are asking questions they didn't ask at one time. And these close encounters are not necessarily all happy events. Oftentimes they're terrifying or even traumatizing events. And so what is really going on? That's the question. And, we'll get into some of these things again next week. So I'm going to stop at this point. I'm at 40, which was farther than I wanted to be. But any questions or comments? And if you have a question, please speak into the mic right there.
Yeah, I wanted to say that you brought up the subject about Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Yeah.
Right? And that story was picked up by Steven Spielberg.
That was, I think, Close Encounters. Was it the third kind or the fourth kind? I don't remember.
It was Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Right, okay.
And who picked up on that story was Steven Spielberg. And
yeah.
It was based on a true story.
Oh, it was based on a true story.
And the story was that John F. Kennedy wanted an exchange program.
Uh-huh.
And he wanted 12 ambassadors to go to SERPO. That's SERPO. Uh-huh. Anyone can look that up on the internet. And then
That's a place?
that's a planet.
Oh.
Okay, SERPO.
Oh, okay.
And then extraterrestrials from Serpo will stay here. And this was the exchange program that John F. Kennedy
Oh,
wanted.
I see.
And I believe that Ronald Reagan may have picked up also on that exchange program. So it was a continuation. So seems like our leaders been holding back on us of what's going on because, you know, this is like 60 years ago. And, you know, nothing's picked up on the media. So this is how the governments, they know how to keep secrets from the public. So now, about 10 weeks ago, you had France President Emmanuel Macron. He wanted a Space Force. And last year, Donald Trump said he wanted a Space Force. And then he gave a long speech of all kinds of technologies that we never thought he couldn't even dream up of, you know, what's possible. On that same day, you had President Vladimir Putin mentioned that he wanted his people on the moon and Mars in 2019. And where are we today from last year, 2019? So again, the governments, the way to just hold back information on what's going on. There's over 70 countries involved in outer space. So the media's control it. We just, you know, we don't know what's really going on, and too much is going on. And I think if Donald Trump becomes the disclosure president, because Ronald Reagan was close, because he was at the United Nations, and he was talking about Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier of Russia. They were talking about, Ronald Reagan was talking about an extraterrestrial threat at the United Nations, at the United Nations Assembly. So he was like very close to being a disclosure president by revealing extraterrestrials to the world. And Star Wars wasn't meant for defense against Russia, because Russia was falling apart. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. So that Star Wars that Ronald Reagan wanted was a defense against extraterrestrials. And as a Marine Captain, Randy Kramer, he's known as a super soldier that was stationed on Mars for 20 years to protect the human colony. And he came out with stories about the U.S. military and the police. We can't depend on them to protect us from an extraterrestrial threat. So something crazy is liable to happen. We had all our world leaders went down to Antarctica in 2016. And they mentioned on the internet that either something or someone told all our world leaders and all our religious leaders to go to Antarctica in 2016. So a lot of strange things going on.
Yeah, there's the entire, we haven't hit government conspiracy yet. That's a whole subsection of the UFOs, because there's been so many cover-ups, and at this point too, not only are there cover-ups, but there's deliberate disinformation as well. So it's hard to know what's real and what's not real, but one thing's for sure, that the government's deep into some kind of connection with the UFOs. And whether there'll be a straightforward disclosure, many people have had the opinion that disclosure could never be full. It would always be partial, because there's too many heads that would roll if full disclosure was, you know, brought to the fore. And people's faith in the whole government would just collapse the next day, you know. But at any rate, they're being forced to dribble out a few things here and there. But in the long run, though, we can see that this is not a new thing. And we'll talk about a little bit later on that actually in the Vedic literatures, there's a whole similar thing that went on 5,000 years ago, where there was a accumulation of beings from other worlds that were using our world as a stage for an attack, not on us, but on yet another area, on the heavenly planets. And at that point, they were removed by the Supreme Lord. And of course, after he left, then they started coming back. So that's a part of it. But We'll talk about that in more detail a little bit later on in the UFO series. So the fact that there is a intricate and quite varied and variety-full collection of off-world beings is quite plain in the Vedic literatures. It talks about many different names of different kinds of beings and what they can do, what they can't do. And as we were saying last week, there are alternative technologies besides the one that we're used to, the idea of rocket propulsion and even, anti-grav and all that kind of stuff. Even technologies that are beyond that, where people can go from one place to another with no mechanical necessities whatsoever. They can do that. But the people who can do that are people who have abilities beyond our normal mortal abilities. And, of course, some yogis can develop those abilities. But, again, we don't recommend developing those abilities. We just recommend actually trying to take seriously the spiritual life. But at any rate, this is all part of a larger picture. Other questions or comments anybody has? Yeah, can you...
Am I on the record? Thank you so much. Thanks for the interesting, presentation. And I was thinking of leaving early, but I couldn't. So, I was really surprised with all these numbers.
Yeah.
It's quite surprising that even like of the fifth and sixth kind, and I've come across some other evidence. I think the mic is working.
What's that?
It's not working, is it?
It should be.
Oh, okay.
I just...
So, yeah, so, so it's interesting, and I had a question that, this, the other kind of evidence that I found was few days back. I was watching some videos on, like Dogons or something like that in Africa.
The Dogon tribe, right?
A tribe which had, which it seems they knew about a supposed black hole or a binary star system.
There's a binary star system,
which was found
right?
much later. But they started slandering them, and that that they said that somehow they, they've planned, this whole thing is set up and whatever. But the whole point is, and this is my question, is not just the aliens, but in general, are we being sort of, because in some cases like evidence like the Dogons, and then again like the Mayans, like they had the map of that lake under Antarctica, but much before we discovered it, and then they had aeroplanes which sort of point to aliens. But are we being like, what's happening is, because going through especially looking at evidence, you pointed out that book in which they sort of try to dismiss everything as some sort of a mental like a mental memory error for a lack of better word. Is this like a collective effort to sort of stop us from thinking out of the box, even when the facts are like so clear?
Plain, right?
And I mean, because it seems very frustrating, like a lot of times like things are like pretty clear,
right.
And but why would you think is that we're being stopped from sort of accepting like paranormal, extraterrestrial, spiritual, like why what could be the motive, like, because
in a word, it's materialism. And there are people who are sold on materialism. In other words, they consider that what is matter is real, and anything beyond our matter, as physicists discuss it, has to be imagination. Now, there are people who genuinely believe that, and there are people who don't believe that, but speak that way because they do want to control others' minds and keep people within a certain box, So you have a kind of disinformation campaign. At the same time, you have a mistaken information campaign. You know, people who genuinely believe that there's nothing outside the box, and people who know that there's something outside the box, but they don't want people to go there. So they work hand in hand with the people who mistakenly believe it, and they help to propagate it. But this has been going on since time immemorial. And if you are really focused on material happiness and material gain and material success, you will be locked into a system which not only keeps you from seeing what's really happening because of a sort of hidden conspiracy, but also because of the way you view life, you know, and you are committed to a society and a way of getting around and doing things that will keep you locked in the box, you know. So you are willingly kind of participating in your own delusion, your own bamboozlement by these other parties, you know. So you have all this going on. And it's amazing, really, how many types of disinformation there are, you know. So we can get a general understanding that there's something going on and that there are people who are not from this planet that are doing things on this planet. And we know that there's technologies that are beyond what we're being shown on television. Either some of them our own government has, and some of them are not our government, but other groups of living beings. We know that. Exactly the details, I don't know if we'll ever know. You know, that's the kind of, you know, it would be nice to know, but for anyone who really would know, then you'd have to be deep into the whole conspiracy in a way that you wouldn't be able to tell anyone, and you would probably not be a happy person yourself. And that's why, in general, we just talk about the idea of engaging in spiritual life, because whatever happens, it'll be okay. We don't need to know all those details. But, of course, as we hear them being surfaced, then we can get more of a clue of in what ballpark all these things really are. That's how I would describe it, and it's the way I personally think about it. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
Just spending a lot of time in spiritual pursuits, like I've done it most of my life, and I feel like I'm confronted with my mortality, which is pretty much the most blatant thing that rears its ugly head up at me, you know,
right.
Mortality. And so, I mean, I've done it until I was blue in the face. I've honestly done, you know, like lots of spiritual search. You know, I've sought out a lot of stuff, the UFOs and everything, but mostly spiritual disciplines. Like I've pursued, you know, I've visited, you know, I've done all
sorts
of
shoes off, please.
Those things, and so like I'm just wondering, are we honestly aren't we on some kind of a ladder of evolution? I mean, we live such short lives, and then it's all over, you know. And sometimes death creeps up on us unawares, like we're caught by surprise.
Right.
And I've had several members of my family or friends or relatives that died, that passed away, and it just hits me like a ton of bricks, because you know, we do our best. Some of us try our best with spiritual enlightenment, and yet it just seems like that, you know, we have that hope and faith, so that when our physical body, when we die physically, that our soul, I mean, that's the whole bottom line. I mean, so my question is, all of this stuff that we experience, isn't it really for our spiritual growth?
Exactly. That's the whole purpose of it. It depends on your what we call bodily identification. We are not our bodies, but we believe that we are. And through spiritual practice, we become more and more aware that we are in a body, but we are not the body. And that one day we will be moved off out of this body. And depending on the nature of our realization, we will either be put into another body, or if we're actually very advanced, we'll go back to the spiritual world, where there's form, there's activity, there's relationships, and there's exchange of emotions. That all exists in the spiritual world. In fact, there it exists fully four-dimensionally. Here it exists in a scaled down three-dimensional manner. But because this is all we remember, we identify with this. We think of this as the real world, when actually that is the real world. And through spiritual work, we gradually more and more disidentify with the body. For some people it happens suddenly, for other people it happens more gradually. But in any case, what matters in the long run is the spiritual work, because actually this whole world is kind of a virtual reality. It looks very real, but nothing here endures. It's like Play-Doh, you know. If you advance what we're doing right now 100 years, what will we be looking at in the same room? Certainly our bodies won't be here. None of the bodies in this room will be here in that form. What will be at this spot? You know, anybody's guess. You know, everything is malleable and it's constantly recycling itself in the material world. But the soul is not. It's permanent, and it pops out at the time of death, and as a result of karma, it goes somewhere else, and then it goes through cycles until the soul finally realizes that it's a servant of God. And when that realization occurs, that's a kind of a light bulb moment. However, on the heels of realizing that, we discover how much we are still junkies for this material world, even if we understand that. And so then we have to go through serious rehab. And that's what the whole process of spiritual life is, to gradually engage in activities that day by day, bit by bit, unhypnotize us to the appearances of this world which seem tangible but ultimately aren't. And death will prove it to all of us. Even close brushes with death, you know, show us how everything that we're doing is based on various degrees of illusion. You know, who are we in this society? It doesn't matter, because when we die, it's all gone in a flash. You know, who are we in a particular family? When we die, we're off to another family somewhere else. What does it matter? How much money do we have? Nobody dies thinking, I wish I'd worked another day at the office and made a little bit more money. At that point, whatever money you have, somebody else gets it, you know. So everything we do is based on layers and layers of illusions, and it's not enough just to theoretically know about them. Then by engaging in practical work, which we call bhakti yoga, by engaging in that, the illusions gradually come off. And by degree, it doesn't happen all at once, but more and more we begin to see that there is a reason, there is a rhyme and reason behind this crazy world in all of its bizarre variety. There's a rhyme and reason to it. And that's what spiritual life is genuinely about. The Vedas have talked about it, but often they're misunderstood or misrepresented by others, just like we have people misrepresenting science, and we have people misrepresenting the government or UFOs. We also have people misrepresenting the Vedas as well, you know, and it's common. But if they're presented in the correct way, everything comes together. It all starts to fit into place, and that's how I would respond, you know. Any other questions or, yeah. Can we get let me see if I can. Just don't stand right next to that speaker. You may get feedback. Oh, good. It works.
Yes. Good evening. Yes. It's funny because this is very synchronous to this moment in the Maya.
Uh-huh.
And I was just reading something about a person having a near-death experience,
Uh-huh.
and going through a UFO moment in the near-death experience, like
Uh-huh.
the spiritual aspect of it. And the person was saying, he was relating to the author through an email, that there was, he recognized in the place where he was at, out of body, that he was in some kind of technological space.
Mhm.
And that he recognized this otherworld entity was there, and because we are a waveform construct. And so because of that aspect of our reality, that he actually felt his soul, not his spirit, his soul being recycled.
Mhm.
And he recognized that he was out from the planet, but he was in some sort of technological place, and what could be considered like I call them other dimensional beings
Mhm.
instead of aliens or extraterrestrials.
That's what
And-
Thompson calls them, by the way, too.
Yeah, I believe that, because they're only that in the visible spectrum. So he felt that he was being sent back to Earth,
Mhm.
like that his spirit was being sent back, and this was a Christian, but he never believed any of that. And so it wasn't like he was having some flashback of something he read or something. This was real for him, and it was a real near-death experience.
Right, right.
Okay, so it was involved with technology, the waveform construct being recycled. That's, in a karmic sense. You know what I mean? I mean, you could take it. Yeah, it was recycled in a karmic sense.
Right, right.
Right. He actually experienced it as technology.
Right.
The karma as technology.
Well, there's a physical technology, but there's also a subtle technology, and that subtle technology is quite. It works differently. It doesn't require any kind of machines or gadgets, So, in the whole process of reincarnation, there's a group of people which we call the demigods. We talked about them last week. They're the people who are the engineers, the people who run the universe. And there's a whole group of them. The universe is mechanical. There's a mechanical aspect to it, but there are people who manage it, just as in a city like New York. There is a water system, there's an electrical system, but there are people who manage it.
You mean manage a hologram?
Yeah, right. It's
Okay.
in one sense, the material world is like a big hologram.
Yeah.
It appears like something that it really is not.
Yeah.
And what's real is actually our soul, but what's not real is the matter. Although it's done in such a way that it's very convincing. And that's why we walk around in it, and we take it as literal fact, when actually it isn't, Nothing in the material world is what it appears to be. It's plastic, it's moving, it's changing.
But I think that somehow suffering and pain and fear is really the important thing in terms of generating that reality. That's the reality. I think that somehow that affects the waveform, and that keeps the reality going.
Well, it has an aspect to it. The way the Vedas talk about that, when you identify with matter, you immediately feel fear.
Yeah.
Because you think you'll
you're gonna
die.
lose it, yeah.
The body certainly will. There's ample evidence that it will. However, the soul won't.
Yeah.
So when you identify with the soul, then you lose that fear. In fact, I've seen a lot of stories about people who have had out-of-the-body experiences, where once they had that, they had a completely different feeling about death, because they've already been out of their body once and nearly left it behind. And sometimes people leave their body behind, and they're depressed when they have to come back to it, So.
Yeah, I hear that too.
So, that's because the body is not a happy thing in many ways. It's something that we live with, and we need to do something with. And if we do the right thing with it, we eventually get released from bodies altogether. We have a form, and that form has eyes and legs and mouth and all that kind of thing, but it's not a material form.
Yeah.
But in the material world, we are drivers of these cars. We drive them around.
High maintenance, right?
Yeah, yes. We're driving this thing around for a number of years until it finally gets too old and bumped up, and then we have to go to another one. Until we get out of the cycle of reincarnation and we can get back to our original form, which has arms and legs and eyes and does things, smells things, hears things, has relationships with others, but it doesn't have veins. It's not damageable. It can't be harmed. In the spiritual world, all these things can happen without any of these other kind of unwanted aspects, which are part of this world, because this world is like a hologram. It's not fully real.
But in the spiritual world, right? The spiritual world in which you refer to, is it so that we have so anthropomorphized spirituality, and so we are essentially saying that it's going to be replicated somehow in our physical bodies, have to replicate themselves in the spiritual?
Yeah, I know that way of thinking, and the Vedas talk about it, that generally I think of it as like an hourglass, that there is the world that we see, and sometimes people talk about the white light or the one, where everything comes together. But that's like a focal point. And then through that focal point, there's a whole other world above. And so this world is a model of something. Like on a television screen, you're seeing things, that they're actually three-dimensional, but on the screen we're only seeing them in two-dimensionals. But we know somewhere there's a real three-dimensional thing. Like if you're watching somebody on television, you know that there's a real person somewhere. You're seeing a two-dimensional version of it. So we're seeing a world, but there's a real world. This is the two-dimensional version of it here, the Kmart version of it, right? And we can stay here as long as we want and enjoy the illusion, but the illusion never makes us happy. And the illusion never seems to be what it's cracked up to be. It always lets us down in some kind of way. And one day we figure out, hey, that's dumb to stay here. So how do I go back? So we are people now, and we always were people. We may not always be in these forms, that's a fact. But we are people now, and we always were and always will be people. The question is, will we stay lifetime after lifetime, repeating the game in the material world, each time having a family, a language, a gender, a position in society, a certain kind of whole array of various associations with ourselves until we die and we put them all aside, and then we get a new one and we go through the whole thing again. We can go on doing that. But the problem is nothing in this material world actually does it for us. It's like seeing a beautiful, very nicely prepared dinner, but it's on a TV. It looks great, but you can't eat it, because you can't eat a TV screen image, But there is a real meal somewhere, and that's the nature of the spiritual world. So that explains the concept of why we're individuals. We always were and always will be. And there's another world that this world is patterned on, and that's what we call a spiritual world.
It's I don't want to take up time, but
No, go ahead.
It's funny because there was a vignette once I saw on Channel 13 where this food critic, his name was Manly Kingston, he went all over the place eating different things, and he even engaged in cannibalism. And there was a point that he got really depressed, and someone told him that they could capture a ghost for him. And he went into this abbey, and this guy had a contraption, and he captured the ectoplasm. The food critic ate the ectoplasm, and at that point, he cuts away to him driving in a Rolls Royce, and still looking depressed. And this old guy comes and he knocks on his window, and he says, "Hey, Gov, you got a shilling?" And the guy looks at him. The guy says, "I'm hungry. You got a shilling?" So the guy looks at him and says, "You don't know what hunger is." Because the guy in the Rolls Royce had eaten everything.
Right.
Including a ghost.
Right.
And he's telling the guy who's literally hungry.
Right.
Right? That he doesn't know what hunger is.
Right.
And I always think about that in terms of maybe even describing what you're saying.
Well, that's it. That's the existential hunger we all have. We wonder what it will be that will actually satisfy it. And eventually we find out if we're serious about it.
Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right.
I got it wrong.
What is your name
My
again?
name is Garfield.
Garfield, right. Yeah, I remember now from last time. Anyone else have something? Next time I'll have the two cables hooked up.
Take care.
All right. Oh, if anyone's interested, we're going to end here in a minute. There's a vegetarian dinner across in the other building. So let me wrap it up here real quick, and then we'll talk informally if you like while we're breaking down. And then if anybody wants to, we can come across to 25 First Avenue for a free vegetarian dinner if you're into it. Let me do my sign off here. So what's up with that? Every Thursday, we have a program here at 26 2nd Avenue between 7 and 8:30. So if you're in the city, come and see us. And we're doing UFOs. Next week, we're going to continue with close encounters, and we'll move on into some specific actual accounts of close encounters. Thank you all very much. Hare Krishna.